here with you for our Monday edition of Live Streams in Dry Places. Just want to encourage you, let you know that we love you, we're praying for you, especially those of us that are in Worthington and Nobles County as we come face to face with COVID-19 in the midst of everything that's going on. So, um, just want to do a kind of for those of you that are part of our Lakeside family and were able to jump on our Zoom service yesterday, this will be a little bit of a repeat, but for many of you that were not able to join us, I wanted to just kind of give you some truths from and share some truths from Psalm 112, and I entitled my brief devotional yesterday called A Righteous Response in Restless Times. And I think Psalm 112 is so appropriate for us today as we just continue to band together and navigate today's current events. The key, one of the key points that I think the psalmist brings out is trusting in the Lord. Now, I know that that is an often cliche Christian phrase that is just tossed around and ends up becoming meaningless. But I think if we can capture the truest essence of that idea of what it means to trust God in all times, in all ways, is it is an extremely powerful reality for God's people. And so I hope that you will be encouraged. Psalm 112 talks about verse 4 talks about light dawns in the darkness for the upright. He is gracious, merciful, and righteous. Lists several characteristics of a righteous person in the midst of darkness. And darkness is assumed in the life of a righteous person. That because we live in a sin-fallen world, we will face evil, we will face hardship, we will face darkness. And yet the verse 4 starts with light will shine in the darkness. That there's this constant living in this tension of the already not yet. Of Jesus saves, but will ultimately save his people in the final day. It's that tension that we feel that for every curse there's blessing. There's no villains without heroes. There's no betrayer without a redeemer. You can't have rupture without repair. And so this tension that we find ourselves in the midst of dark places is the promise of God is that light will dawn in the darkness for righteous people, upon righteous people. And he continues to lay out two things that I think are extremely helpful. The attributes, characteristics of righteous people in the midst of uncertain times. And the first one is that if you look at verses 5 and verse 9, righteous people are extremely and radically generous. Verse 5 says that it is well with the man who deals generously and lends, who conducts his affairs with justice. There's this honest pursuit of justice in his generosity. And in verse 9, he distributes freely, is given, and he is given to the poor. And so what a message for us today as God's people to be able to have the liberty, to have the freedom in Jesus, to be able to live in a way that demonstrates radical generosity, because the righteousness that is God's, he gives to you in Jesus. 2 Corinthians 5:21 talks about this exchange of righteousness, God's righteousness to us, and he takes our sin and casts it away. He deals with it in its fullness at the cross. And so it's this beautiful idea in Psalm 111, the psalm right before it, and in Psalm 112, where Psalm 111 talks about God's righteousness. And then in Psalm 112, the psalmist turns around and says that God's righteousness is now ours. And so it's this beautiful reality that we have as God's people, that we can live generously, live radically with such freedom and joy because of God's righteousness that is now ours. The second characteristic of a righteous person in the midst of restless times is that they are steadfast and firm. So while verse 5 and verse 9 talk about the righteous person's generosity, verses 6, 7, and 8 discuss the steadfastness, the constancy of a righteous person. If you look at verse 6, it talks about that the righteous will never be moved. Verse 7, his heart is firm. Verse 8, their heart is steady. They will not be afraid. Mondays, I've been constantly going back to the passage in 1 John chapter 4, verse 18, where it says that there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. And again, I want to continue down that same vein for this Facebook Live edition of Live Streams in Dry Places, because I believe that this is such a unique time for us to be able to pay attention to what God is attempting to say. And he is saying to us, one of the things I believe he's saying to us is that he's got this. He's in control, and that his people, we as his people, do not have to be afraid. And so one of the characteristics of the other characteristic that I think the psalmist brings out in Psalm 112 is that a righteous person is not only radically generous, they are steadfast and firm because there's no fear in love. And God's perfect love being perfected in us casts that fear out. You see that this steadfastness. Look at verse 7. Such an amazing text for today. It says that the righteous person is not afraid of bad news. In the midst of all of this bad news, the righteous person is not afraid of bad news. Their heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. His heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. And so I would just desire to encourage you today in that reality that God has got this. He is in complete control. So whatever you're facing, some of you are losing your businesses. Some of you are suffering severe financial setback. Others of you are all of this loss and all of this pain is bringing up old hurts from the past, of the grief of losing a loved one, the grief and loss in various seasons that you've had in your past are now being expressed again in the present because of the current events. And so, can I encourage you today that that trusting in the Lord and believing in the gospel that Jesus has paid it all for you and I, and that in his payment in full, he gives you the righteousness of God. It's now yours. It's now mine. And that God looks at us in our plight. He looks at us in the midst of this global pandemic. He looks at us in the midst of our fear, our anxiety, our worry, our pain. And he desires to let you know that he's got this, that he's in control. Blessed is the one who fears the Lord, who greatly delights in his commandments. That's shorthand for trusting in God and believing in the gospel. And can I encourage you with that truth today, that the righteous respond in these ways, in radical generosity, in this steadfastness in the midst of darkness and uncertain times, in the face of fear, and produces within us this beautiful reality of God's righteousness and holiness being perfected in us by the power of his Holy Spirit, to glorify God and to seek out the welfare of our neighbors. And so I pray that prayer over you today as Lakeside Church, as God's people, wherever you're at in this world, whatever you're experiencing, that Psalm 112 would feed your soul today, and that this live stream would meet you in a dry place today. So whatever you're working through, whatever you're asking God for, may you experience His presence, His love, and His incredible grace to you today. Love to hear from you. What God is showing to you. If there's a promise of God that you're clinging to in the midst of all of the circumstances surrounding the current events of today, or maybe you want to share something that the Holy Spirit is asking you to submit to Him, something that you need to give over to Him. I'd love to hear from you, whatever that is. Whether that's a certain particular fear that He's asking you, hey, I got this, give it to me. Or this is a promise of God. I'm trusting in His care and His provision and His love for me, that I'm loved and accepted in Him. Whatever that may be, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Thanks for joining us today for this Monday edition of Live Streams in Dry Places. God bless you. We love you.